My name is Beena Sarwar. I'm a journalist from Pakistan, and I'm in Cambridge these days, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I've just come here to New York for this panel invited by Brian Drolet of Deep Dish, who's organized this panel. Thanks to Ali Naqvi, who has disappeared somewhere, who suggested having this panel for a last-minute edition. And we have a really great set of speakers here. And that's Ali. Thank you, Ali, for inserting this panel into the left forum. So we have a little bit under 2 hours, and we have several speakers, but I don't think any of them are going to speak for very, very long. I just want to say that, I've just come back from Pakistan, and Faiz, as you know, his relevance, this panel is titled Anthems of Resistance, which is a title stolen from Ali Mir's book that he co-authored, that he's going to speak about. But Anthems of Resistance, poetry, and politics has always gone together, particularly in the subcontinent. And in Karachi last Saturday, we had a huge public event at which 15,000 people signed a petition against right-wing extremism and vigilante violence, and at the banner, and I wanted to show you guys a picture of that, just to show. There's a big banner that they put up, on which was written in big letters, "Uthega anal haq ka nara," which means and there shall arise the slogan of "I am the truth." I mean, it's a bad translation, but that's Faiz's poetry was emblazoned on top of this very defiant public event in Karachi, where thousands of people came and signed. And when the mullahs come out, when the right wing comes out, and they bring out 20 or 30,000 people, that's headline news. But when 15,000 people come out at the risk of their lives and sign a petition against the right wing, it hardly makes a dent in the public discourse. And that is where Faiz helps us, is to make a dent in public discourse about the anthems of resistance, quote unquote, and how people take forward the progressive politics, secular, progressive, democratic politics. The same group, Citizens for Democracy, and if you search them on the web, you'll find Citizens for Democracy. It's a WordPress.com blog, citizensfordemocracy.wordpress.com. In April, they're organizing a huge Jashin-e-Faiz in Karachi at the KMC Sports Complex. Those of you who know Karachi know that's a huge sports arena, and they want to attract thousands of people. The aim is to raise a voice against so-called religious bigotry and extremism and vigilante violence, and against the blasphemy laws. But you can't get people coming out on the streets if you say come out and rally against the blasphemy laws. But you can get people come out and say rally for Faiz, and it's the same message. So you don't have to hit people over the head with the message. It can come through poetry. So that's just my way of introducing that. The relevance of Faiz, at least right now where I'm coming from, is so intense right now in his 100th birth anniversary. We're going to start this panel with Ali Mir, who is a professor at the College of Business at William Patterson University, and he's co-authored this book, as I mentioned, Anthems of Resistance, which is a celebration of progressive Urdu poetry on Urdu poets of the progressive writers movement, and he has also written lyrics for many Bollywood films. We can ask him later which ones. But Ali, would you start?
Sure.
And you can use the thing if you want.
Okay. Intisab, dedication from a book of poetry. Aaj ke naam aur aaj ke gham ke naam, to this day and to the sorrows of this day. Aaj ka gham ke hai zindagi ke bhare gulstan se khafa, zard patton ka ban, zard patton ka ban jo mera des hai, dard ki anjuman jo mera des hai. To the sorrows of this day, sorrows that are disillusioned with the flowering gardens of life and have turned into a forest of yellowing leaves. A forest of yellowing leaves, that is my country. A congregation of pain, that is my country. कि लड़कों के अफसुरदा जानों के नाम, किर्म खर्दों दिलों और ज़बानों के नाम, पोस्टमैनों के नाम, टांगे वालों के नाम, रेल वालों के नाम, कारखानों के भोले जियालों के नाम, बादशाह जहां वालिये मासिवा नायबुल्लाह फिल अर्ज़ दहक़ां के नाम. dedicated to the sad lives of clerks, to the worm-eaten hearts and tongues, to the postmen, the coachmen, the railroad workers, to the innocent and brave souls that toil in the factories, and most of all to the farmers, who are the kings of this world, the rulers of the next, and the representatives of God on earth. On the evening of November 24th, 1934, at the Nanking Hotel in London, a group of young Indian expats had gathered together over an intense discussion about a document which was quite audacious in scope, for it sought to articulate a manifesto for the future of Indian literature. The fog of history has blurred some of the names of the attendees, but the institution that emerged from this meeting was to majestically straddle the traditions of Indian literature or South Asian literature for a long period of time to come. Sajjad Zahir, who was the organizer of this meeting, was one of the authors of Angare, a book of short stories written by 3 men and a woman that had been published in India in 1932. And the stories dealt with the decadence and hypocrisy of social and religious life in India, and took more than one pot shot at religious orthodoxy, with what one of the writers of the book, Ahmad Ali, referred to as an absence of circumspection. The book generated an immediate uproar and was banned because it was seen as blasphemous and vulgar, which was perhaps not surprising because its iconic story, Jannat Ki Basharat, ends with a holy man waking up from a dream to find his wife scornfully laughing at him because he has presumably ejaculated on the Quran that he had been sleeping on. Zahir set about trying to form the Progressive Writers Association, which held its first meeting in Lucknow in 1936, in which the presidential address was delivered by Munshi Premchand, the towering figure of Hindustani literature, who accused artists of a tendency to cling to the skirts of the rich and the powerful and turn their gaze only on the beauty of palaces and that which lay within them. And he said that the only time the artist turns and looks at the poor is to mock them. And he said that it was time for a change. And in a very famous line, he said, "Hame husn ke meyar badalne honge." We will have to change the standards of beauty. And Urdu poets of this time took this to heart, and the metaphors of Urdu poetry were altered in the hands of poets like Faiz as never before. The rose still bloomed in the spring, the cup of wine was still passed around, the moth was still scorched by the flames, the bulbul still sang songs of love, and the wretched lovers still paced the streets of their beloveds, who dispensed favor to all but the protagonist himself. But as Noonmeen Rashid says about Faiz and the other poets of the Progressive Writers movement, their poetry enabled the time-worn cliches of the Persian and Urdu ghazal to acquire a renewed sensitivity and to be recharged with meaning, so that the solitary suffering of the disappointed romantic lover was transformed into the suffering of humanity at large. The others on the panel will contextualize Faiz a bit more and give you a sense of some of the many facets of his life. So let me set the stage for them by reading 3 brief poems and offering you their translations. I want to read them in the original largely because I want to convey to you the sense of the lyricality of what he wrote. लहू का सुराग, कहीं नहीं है कहीं भी नहीं लहू का सुराग, न दस्त न आँखों खातिल न आस्ती पे नशान, न सुर्खिए लब खंजर न रंगे नो के सिना, न खाक पर कोई धब्बा न बाम पर कोई दाग, कहीं नहीं है कहीं भी नहीं लहू का सुराग, न सर्फ खिदमत शाहां के खूं बहा देती, नदी की नज़र के बयान जजा देती, न रज़्म गाह में बरसा के मोतबर होता, किसी अलम पे रखम हो के मुश्तहर होता, पुकारता रहा बे आसरा यतीम लहू, किसी को बहरे समाअत न वक्त था न दिमाग, न मुद्दई न शहादत हिसाब पाक हुआ, ये खून खाक नशीना था रिज़्क़ खाक हुआ. Nowhere at all is any trace of the blood, not on the murderer's hands, fingernails, or sleeve. No blood reddens the tongue of the blade, nor brightens the tip of the spear. No blood marks the soil or stains the rooftop. Nowhere at all is any trace of the blood. This blood wasn't shed in the services of kings that it could receive recompense, nor was it sacrificed at the altar of religion that it could be rewarded. Neither did it spill in the battlefield that it could be honored or memorialized on a battle standard. It cried out, this helpless, orphaned blood. But none had the ability to listen, nor the time, nor the patience. No plaintiff stepped forward, no one bore witness, and so the account was closed, while the blood of the dirt dwellers seeped silently into the dirt. All right, the next one, called Dasht-e-Tanhai, is a favorite of mine. It's a very evocative poem in an extremely heart-wrenching kind of a way, but at the same time, it is a promise poem in its own understated manner. And I'll read little bits of it along with the translation. दश्त-ए-तन्हाई में ऐ जाने जहां लर्ज़ा हैं, तेरी आवाज़ के साए, तेरे होठों के सराब. दश्त-ए-तन्हाई में दूरी के खसो खाक तले, खिल रहे हैं तेरे पहलू के समन और गुलाब. In this lonely desolation, O life of my world, tremble the shadows of your voice and the mirages of your lips. In this lonely desolation, beneath the ash and dust of distance, bloom the jasmines and roses of your nearness. उठ रही है कहीं कुर्बत से तेरी सांस की आँच, अपनी खुशबू में सुलगती हुई मध्यम मध्यम. From somewhere close by arises the heat of your breath, smoldering in its own fragrance, slowly, unhurriedly, while far away beyond the horizon, the shiny dewdrops of your loving glance fall gently one by one. इस कदर प्यार से ऐ जाने जहां रखा है, दिल के रुखसार पे इस वक्त तेरी याद ने हाथ, यूं गुमा होता है गरचे है अभी सुबह फिराक, ढल गया हिज्र का दिन, आ भी गई वस्ल की रात. With such love, O life of my world, does the hand of your memory caress the cheek of my heart, that in this moment I can allow myself to believe, even though it is still the morning of farewell, that the day of separation has at last ended, that the night of union has finally begun. And just because I want to end in a light-hearted way, here's a slightly light-hearted poem, which at times I think would make a nice epitaph for me. वो लोग बहुत खुशकिस्मत थे जो इश्क को काम समझते थे या काम से आशिकी करते थे. हम जीते जी मसरूफ रहे, कुछ इश्क किया कुछ काम किया, काम इश्क के आड़े आता रहा और इश्क से काम उलझता रहा, फिर आखिर तंग आकर हमने दोनों को अधूरा छोड़ दिया. They indeed were very fortunate, those who thought of love as work, or loved the work they did. We spent our lives forever occupied, loved a little, worked a little. Work kept interfering with love, while love tangled up work, till finally, fed up, we abandoned both incomplete.
Thank you, Ali. That was really interesting and insightful, and also at the end entertaining a little bit. I'm going to introduce Andy McCord, who's a freelance writer, poet, and translator, who's, oh sorry, am I speaking too softly? Can you hear me? I want to introduce Andy McCord, who is a freelance writer, poet, and translator with a long-time interest in the culture of India, Pakistan, and the rest of South Asia. He's lived and worked in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and I've known Andy for the last 15 years since he was a Fulbright scholar in Lahore. And he's going to he's going to talk about Faiz's time in captivity and some of the poems he wrote at that time. Andy.
Thank you. So I'm going to move up a little bit from the period that Ali was talking about in the 30s at the formation of the progressive writers. At that time, Faiz was a recent graduate of, he did an English degree and then English master's and an Arabic master's, and he was teaching in and around Lahore. He then, in World War II, after the, the breakup of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, he joined the British Army and he organized cells in the Indian Army to build morale and solidarity, because the British actually went and sought out communists because they thought they could understand the people. They were very worried of Japanese kind of propaganda. Then after independence, he was a newspaper editor. So in fact, while he was, from his undergraduate days, very well known as a poet, between the publication of his first book in 1941 and his arrest in 1951, he wrote very few poems because he was involved in all of these other activities. Not only was he a newspaper editor, he was the vice president of the Pakistan Trade Union Federation, which was the leading left trade union in Pakistan. But on March 9th, 1951, 50 years ago this month, which is the month of spring in Pakistan. If you've been there in May, you know it gets very, very hot. And so really the best time of year is sort of beginning of February to late March, and it's known as spring and appears in the poetry very much. But Faiz was arrested just in the middle of that season. And I'm going to read a few excerpts from some American diplomatic correspondence from that time, which has now either been released or I've got from the Freedom of Information Act. And then I'll read a few of the poems he wrote in solitary confinement in sort of the months from now till June of that year. But this is a quote from someone named Warwick Perkins, who was a counselor of the U.S. Embassy in Karachi at that time. So it's sort of like the WikiLeaks of that day. Until March 9th, the general opinion of Faiz, even in reasonably well-informed circles in Pakistan, was that he was essentially just a poet with rather fuzzy leftist sentiments. This opinion was reflected in early reporting from this embassy, but in a dispatch of July 7, 1950, it was stated that it had become apparent that Faiz was, in fact, an important leader of the communists of West Pakistan. As editor of the Pakistan Times and supervising editor of the Lahore and Karachi Imroz, which is the Urdu sister publication, Faiz directed the most important communist-line newspapers in Pakistan. The entire peace campaign, which was a Soviet-aligned anti-nuclear worldwide movement that Faiz was quite involved with, throughout West Pakistan, has been organized and directed openly by Faiz, as had most of his other principal communist, activities during 1950 and 51. From this and much other, mention of Faiz and his facile pen, we see a great deal of concern by the Americans about Faiz, and also about the intellectual side of the left in Pakistan. The Communist Party was extremely small. The full Communist Party of Pakistan never met. There was an East Pakistan and a West Pakistan. It was never possible for the Politburo to meet. But one of the documents says the intellectual group is a much greater threat to security than the later group. And this came from Pakistan to the State Department, and those documents are what are in the National Archives. And I found that Reader in Washington underscored that. So while one can't blame the Americans for Faiz's arrest, we can tell that they were pleased with it. And immediately after the arrest in this conspiracy, which was a mixed bag, it was a mistake and was opposed by most communists in Pakistan and in India. But immediately after that, full-scale arrest of leftist intellectuals, students, and workers began in Pakistan. The Communist Party was banned in 1954, and in many respects there was never a left after that. For Faiz and his family, he disappeared in the middle of the night. No one knew where he was taken. And the initial mood was very dire. The press was saying the conspirators there were 3 civilian, either communists or Faiz was probably not a member, but he was very much in sympathy with the communists. And then there were 9 army officers and the wife of 1 army officer. So it was a mix of kind of disgruntled army people who had come to the left to provide political guidance and a political structure after a coup that they proposed. But that, those discussions went on, and some of the documents have come out. But in February, there was a long meeting in which it was decided to abandon the plan. So on the day of the arrest, the conspiracy was over. But the arrests went forward, and it's difficult to know why, except that on March 11th, there was an election in the province of Punjab in Pakistan, which was the first election held in Pakistan at any level since independence in 1947. So there may have been some concern about guiding the result of that election. Anyway, Faiz was held in, incommunicado for about 3 months. And then while these other people were rounded up. On June 3rd, he got on a specially scheduled train to travel from Lahore in Punjab to Hyderabad, Sindh, which is north of Karachi, in the middle of the desert, more or less, as prisoner number 13 in the Rawalpindi conspiracy case. He looked out the window at the heat coming off the newly cut wheat fields, the few scattered shade trees, the mud and brick walls of villages, the eucalyptus lining canal banks, and the huge bowl of sky over the flat floodplain. The way we traveled was something to see, Faiz wrote to his English wife, Alice, back in Lahore. Except for the lack of a band playing, it was quite a procession. As soon as I boarded the train, I felt my troubles fall away. There was the pleasure of taking a journey, the joy in seeing the outside world again, elaborate food, many comforts together at once. On the afternoon we set out, for the first time since the night they suddenly took me away, there was good food to be had. Roasted chicken, pilau, fruit cocktail, and ice cream. Unfortunately, though, I wasn't hungry. Faiz probably is a little bit, extra cheerful to cheer his wife up in this. His jailmate said that he looked ill and very thin when he came to them in Hyderabad jail. But he cheered up quickly in their company and with access to cigarettes. He was a great smoker. On June 8th, the letter I just read, he wrote on June 8th, which was his first letter. 6 days later, he sent Alice 6 poems, which I'm about to read from, which he composed in his head. He had no paper or pen, in solitary, and was able to write down as soon as he got. His son-in-law, Shoaib, said that there were many more, and if he could have remembered them, he always said he would have been an immortal. But anyway, he sends her these 6 poems, writing, "In these 3 months, I have been able to write twice as many poems as I did in the previous 3 years. And while his imprisonment was a great injustice, it's very true that Faiz resumed his poetic productivity because of his 4 years in prison in the Rawalpindi conspiracy. And a lot of his reputation is based on those prison poems. I'm going to read a few of them. The first one, I should say that all but the last of these are in very traditional forms. There's two quatrains, 4-line short poems in rhymes, and then 3 ghazals, which is the traditional Persian and Urdu form, and there's one which seems sort of modeled on an English sonnet, but where a few, like the Intisab that Ali had read, is Faiz kind of learning from Pablo Neruda and other international poets and experimenting with form. When he's left with no paper and pen, the traditional devices which he was steeped in were very useful to him. So the first of these quatrains, which I'll try to read in the Urdu, goes like this. Matae lo kalam chin gaya to kya gam hai, ke khune dil mein dabuli hai anguliyon mein, zuban pe mohar lagi hai to kya ke rakhti hai, har ek halqa-e zanzir mein zuban hai. What of it if pen and ink are taken away? I will dip my fingers in heart's blood, and link by link, if they seal my lips, I will open the mouths of my chains. So this is, the imagery is all very traditional, but when these poems came out, and they did come out fairly quickly to Alice, and she had them published in India and Pakistan, and the actual income from the publication of the poems, which was tiny, as income for poetry is always, was important to the sustenance of the family, because this English wife was left in Lahore with 2 small children. She got a job editing the children's pages of the Pakistan Times. Many of their friends were distant from them because the situation was dire, and Alice, being a English working class woman, pulled through. But Faiz's poems were, put food on the table. And actually his whole life he always worked. He was a leftist and an intellectual, but I think every day of his life he had a paying job because he had this kind of sense of family responsibility. This next one is a ghazal. In a way you could look at it as Faiz's only testimony in the case, and people have seen kind of explanations of what the conspiracy was in the poem. So it's the first line is Tu aaye ho na shabe intezar guzri hai. No sign of you, or that this night waiting is over. Searching for us again and again, daybreak passes over. If in our infatuation, what happens uselessly, though injuries of it to the heart do not soon pass over. A night spent in discourses with the wise is truly spent outside her house, but now it passes over. And in this whole story, what was never mentioned is the very unpalatable thing that they cannot get over. No rose has bloomed, we did not meet her, we drank no wine. What a strange shade has the spring now that passes over. Who knows what the gardener is wreaking on the garden? Through this cage, the morning wind now restlessly blows over. So a lot of people will say that the couplet that starts "Wo baat sare fasane mein jiska zikr na tha," and in this whole story, what was never mentioned, it's an oblique reference to the conspiracy. It's like we didn't actually do it, and that's the one that's so unpalatable to them. But you see Faiz here, he's commingling the separation from the beloved, which is inherited from his poetic tradition, with the separation from a better political world. And contrary to making an anthem about, let's go forward to the barricades, he's giving himself and the reader a kind of psychological space in which to endure what may be, in this case, a long imprisonment or a long, political processes. As one grows older, we realize that change happens slowly, and it's really rare that positive political events are, concatenating. This next one is Pope Odar Kamosam, which is sort of literally the season of the gallows and the chain. The waiting is wicked, the weather is foul. It is no weather, it is springtime. Heavy of heart with sadness of living, I wish for pagan beauty around me like weather. Face flushed with love, joy for the joyless, rest for the restless, and enveloping weather. But with no cup or cupbearer, without their story, what use are the clouds on the mountains in this weather? Without company of friends, what use to me is that quivering under cypress trees in a garden? The scars on my heart have pained me but little. But little by little I am preoccupied. Separation is my weather. Passion and gallows and chains this time, force and power and rule this time. You own the cage, but what you cannot control is how the rose will burn the garden clean this time. Dawn breezes, delighted and graceful, slip the noose. Spring will not be snared by the weather this time. And if I miss it, others will know it. The garden lit up, the tumult of thousand, this time. There's a bit of optimism there. And then finally I'll read the one that's modeled on a sonnet, which is in Urdu, Shair Likhta Hai Teri Husn Ka Naam. A poet writes in tribute to you. A poet writes in tribute to you how your mood and your clothing disheveled at dawn, and mornings and noons and nights settled upon us. And you would dress your body in fine clothes sometimes, like a cedar or pine standing grandly in a garden. And my heart submerged its poetry in your lips that were goblet and cup to me. A poet writes in tribute to you. As long as the henna is hot on your hands, words have a bride, and their allure remains. As your young beauty stands, my fate is kind. As long as you breathe, my homeland is brave, though these hours are tight and this pain is real. Your memory makes sweet the bile of these days. A poet writes in tribute to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. We'll have time for questions afterwards. We'll have some time. I just want to add that Andy's, talking about Faiz is a very personal thing for me, because the crackdown that Andy talked about right after Faiz was arrested, my father was part of that, and he led the students' movement, the democratic students' movement in Pakistan, and he was arrested. He was in prison for a year, and he, when Faiz was released, my father by that time had graduated from medical college while in prison, and he and his friends were among the few who went and met Faiz and feted him and were not, were part of that progressive circle that did not disown Faiz at that time. And this interesting about Alice Faiz, the job that she did editing the children's page. My mother had just come from India in 1958 to Pakistan, and that children's page is what sustained her as a young migrant to Pakistan at that time, and she got in touch with Mrs. Faiz at that time, and that's what that connection was. So this is all these resonances. It's interesting for me personally. It makes my being here. I'm a substitute for David, who was supposed to be the moderator and couldn't make it. It's very personal for me in that way. I want to introduce Bilal Hashmi, who's the next speaker, and he's a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature at New York University. And he's also translated Sajjad Zahir's A Night in London. And he's going to talk a little bit about, are you going to go to the podium?
Yes, sir. Yes.
And he's going to talk about, I think, the international context of Faiz, taking further, a little bit of what Andy was talking about, Faiz's context in the political context of Pakistan, and Bilal is going to talk about his influence on the African.
The Afro-Asian.
African.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So the thing that I want to start off with is this question of culture, okay? Because one thing about Faiz Ahmed Faiz is that he was always concerned, or a sort of a lifelong preoccupation of his was this idea of, you know, what is Pakistani culture, right? Pakistani Saqafat or Tamaddun, right? These ideas really permeated his entire sort of nonfiction sort of corpus, right? And it's in relation to that question of culture that we then can start thinking about what, you know, for instance, Faiz thought about, I guess, you know, this idea of national culture for countries that had just recently gained their independence, right? So India, Pakistan, but also the countries of Africa, right? And other parts of Asia. I want to mention Latin America, which was also a continent that was very sort of fond of and held close to his heart. So the thing that I want to sort of suggest here is that because Faiz was never really the official poet of Pakistan, he's sort of the unofficial national poet of Pakistan, there's a way in which that is, in a sense, conducive to thinking of him as an internationalist, right? A poet that transcends national boundaries. Someone who, you know, by virtue of being a poet in Urdu, right, which is a language that is, you know, really, I think today a homeless language, right? You know, becomes sort of this vehicle for an internationalist poetics of solidarity. Okay, so that's something I just wanted to throw out there to begin with. Now, picking up, I guess chronologically from where Andy left off, is in 1958 in Tashkent, the Afro-Asian Writers Movement has its first sort of an inaugural conference. And it's there that Faiz somehow manages to get there and takes part in that meeting. And he's, you know, there in the midst of other writers from other parts of the world, Usman Sembène from Senegal, Pramudia Anantator from Indonesia. I mean, these writers have all sort of gathered there in Tashkent for this new organization, right? So that's in 1958. Then in 1962, and this is, you know, when I believe his first two collections of poetry have come out by that point. He wins the Lenin Peace Prize, okay, in Moscow, and he goes there to and, you know, gives this acceptance speech, right? That has its focus is on peace and freedom. Those are the two concepts that he throws out there, right? Aman and Azadi are the two sort of I guess ideas that he puts into that acceptance speech. But the Lenin Peace Prize, I just want to mention, is was sort of during the Cold War period, I guess the Soviet equivalent of the Nobel Prize, right? So this was a big thing at that time, right? And so the fact of Faiz receiving this award was for not only for Urdu literature, but also one could say for all of South Asian literature, a very unique and auspicious moment. Okay, so also in 1962, Faiz goes to Cuba. Okay, he's invited there as an official guest on the occasion of the 4th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. So again, an interesting sort of moment. He writes a travelogue based on his experiences there, which is entitled Safarnama in Cuba, and very interesting again, right? He's, you know, making all these sorts of comparisons to his native Pakistan and Havana, and you know, it's really a fascinating text, which unfortunately hasn't been translated into English yet. So that's another thing that I wanted to mention in 1962 as well, is that he's in Cuba. What happens subsequently then throughout the 60s, and you know, he while he's in the Soviet Union, he meets Pablo Neruda, who becomes a close friend of his. Also Nazim Hikmet, about whom Faiz has written poems, in fact, and has translated some of his work as well. So he builds these sort of alliances with writers from what was then known as the Third World quite extensively. So this is a period of Faiz's, one would say, involvement in the struggles of the newly independent and decolonizing nations. Now this also becomes a part of his poetry as well. So he writes poems on Africa, Ajawa Africa, right? Come Africa. This is a poem that was written in the 50s or early 60s. He writes about Palestine. He writes about Vietnam, Iranian students protesting in the 50s. I mean, he's really a very keen observer of international affairs, and that and this I think is an interesting way to think about him. In addition to his being a national figure, right? A Pakistani poet, the Pakistani poet in some ways, right? I want to read to you a quotation, and this is from a lecture that Faiz gave, entitled "What is the role of international exchange in cultural development?" And I'll quote him now. Faiz writes, "As a writer, even though I run no state and command no power, I am entitled to feel that I am my brother's keeper, and my brother is the whole of mankind. Out of this vast brotherhood, the nearest and dearest to me are the insulted, the humiliated, the disinherited, the poor, the hungry, and the sick at heart. And this is the relevance to me of Palestine, of South Africa, Zimbabwe, of Chile, of my own people and people like me." So I think this statement sort of encapsulates his internationalist sort of leanings, right, in a sort of succinct manner. Okay, I want to skip really quickly to the 70s. Okay, so in 1977, the dictatorship of General Zia in Pakistan forces Faiz to go into exile. Other poets also do end up leaving the country, such as Ahmed Faiz, who I believe goes to Canada, and others as well. Many are arrested, and this is a very challenging time in Pakistan. Okay, and what Faiz says is that he goes into self-exile to Beirut in 1978 in Lebanon, and it's from there that he begins to edit the Afro-Asian literary journal Lotus, okay? And he's the editor of that until his death in 1984. So from 78 to 84, he's the editor of this really, at that time, the most prominent, I would say, Afro-Asian periodical. So, he's doing that editorial work in the midst of, this, the Lebanese Civil War. And I want to quickly read them because I find this very interesting. An excerpt from Mahmoud Darwish's Memory for Forgetfulness, which is an account of the 1982 Israeli siege of Beirut. And this is in the midst of a discussion about what is the role of intellectual, right? What is the role of the poet and poetry during times like these? And so Darwish writes, "Yet our great friend from Pakistan, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, is busy with another question. Where are the artists? Which artists, Faiz, I ask? The artists of Beirut. What do you want from them? To draw this war on the walls of the city. What's come over you, I exclaim. Don't you see the walls tumbling?" So, this is Darwish talking to Faiz, and Faiz is really, even in a moment like this, interested in artistic expression, as in a sense, a form of resistance, right? So I thought that was an interesting thing to mention. Also, during this period, another Palestinian, the literary critic Edward Said, goes to Beirut and meets Faiz, and in an off-cited essay, Reflections on Exile, which was published in Harper's, he mentions this encounter, and he says, quote, "To see a poet in exile, as opposed to reading the poetry of exile, is to see exile's antinomies embodied and endured with a unique intensity." Then he adds, "Naturally, his closest friends were Palestinian, but I sense that although there was an affinity of spirit between them, nothing quite matched." language, poetic convention, or life history. But one thing that I think Said doesn't emphasize here is that they do share something, which was a sort of internationalist spirit at that time, right? Which I'm sort of arguing is a sort of defining element in Faiz's poetry at this time. And this again gets filtered into his, or makes its way into his poetry as well. So in a later collection, I believe his final collection of poems, Wabare Ayam, The Dust of Passing Days, there's the poem, there are a couple of poems, on the Palestinian struggle, on the city of Beirut, Ek Nagma Karbala Beirut ke liye, a song for the Karbala of Beirut. So he's on the one hand dealing with these figures, these different movements, these different intellectuals, but then also composing poetry about them. Okay, I should conclude now, but in order to do that, I'm going to read to you something that I put together. So I want to arrive at something like a conclusion by drawing on the radical energies of our present moment, in which poets like Faiz continue to have a spectral presence. Let us turn once more to South Asia, the region wherein Faiz still has the greatest following. At around this time last year, Outlook, one of India's leading English language news magazines, carried a rare and impassioned cover story on the country's ongoing Maoist insurgency, potentially the most violent and threatening one anywhere in the world since the late 1960s. The piece was written by none other than the internationally acclaimed activist and writer Arundhati Roy, whom many of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. Roy's article is unique because, well, for at least two reasons. She is, to my knowledge, the first journalist to venture into the jungles of central India in order to interview the armed tribals. And secondly, her account is for the most part sympathetic to what has been described as, quote, India's greatest internal security threat. Her lengthy and insightful essay is based on weeks of interaction with Maoists who have felt compelled to take up arms against the state. Among these militants, whom Roy has dubbed Gandhians with guns, is a 17-year-old female, the only one in the group who speaks English. We chat late into the night, notes Roy. I gave her my copy of Neruda's Captain's Verses. I brought it along just in case. And so, as if the sudden appearance of Los Versos del Capitan, Neruda's 1953 collection of love poems, were not peculiar enough in this most unlikely of settings, the Urdu poetry of Faiz Ahmed Faiz also follows suit, right? So Roy writes, Comrade Sukhdev, who's another Maoist leader, asks if he can download the music from my iPod into his computer. We listened to a recording of Iqbal Bano singing Faiz Ahmed Faiz's I'm Making It. Right, this is a poem that we'll talk about later. At a famous concert in Lahore at the height of the repression during the Zia-ul-Haq years. And so she quotes a few lines from the poem and then writes, 50,000 people in the audience in that Pakistan began a defiant chant. Inqilab Zindabad, Inqilab Zindabad. Long live revolution, long live revolution. And then concludes Roy, all these years later, that chant reverberates around this forest. Strange, the alliances that get made. Now, just as a final note, I want to say that these alliances may not have really, are not actually that strange, right? If you think about a poet such as the one we're gathered here to discuss, he's really someone who's thinking very actively about what's happening around the world, not only in his country but in many other countries of the world. So I just want to end then by reciting a few lines from the only poem I believe that Faiz wrote in English, which is entitled "The Unicorn and the Dancing Girl." And I want to do this, and this was published in 1961. And I want to read it, or these last few lines, because I think they not only capture the spirit of Faiz's internationalism, sort of at the height of the decolonization era, but also serve to remind us, I think, in these turbulent times, about that unfinished project that was known as the Third World. So I'll read those lines. So Faiz says, "The birth of time out of timelessness is beset like all births with travail and hope and joy and apprehension. And its birth in Pakistan, as elsewhere in the newly liberated countries of Asia and Africa, is as yet only a small flag of freedom, raised against the bannered and embattled host of fear, want, and hunger and pain, and the death of human hearts. It is in times like these, filled with travail and hope and joy and apprehension, when small flags of freedom are once again being raised in the countries of Asia and Africa and beyond, that one thinks of, the anthems of resistance of Faiz, right? The most internationalist of all poets to have written in that homeless language known as Urdu." Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. Our next speaker is Naomi Lazar, who's a poet and a translator, and she's wrote the screenplay The White Raven and the stage play The Elephant and the Dove. And she also translated The True Subject, Selected Poems of Faiz Ahmed Faiz in 1987, and has, and I think her book Ordinances, the last publication that you did was 2010, was about poems written in the voice of authority, addressing people. But it was very, very relevant, I think, in a satirical kind of a way to this panel. So, Naomi Lazard.
My name is Naomi Lazard.
Lazard,
It's
I'm
okay.
sorry.
It's okay, everybody does that.
Okay.
We met at the East-West Center, and we were put up there. We had rooms. And it was a building that was in the middle of a park without windows. It was like a refrigerator. We walked into that building, and it was a tomb. But our bedrooms had windows, but they were in a different building. And Faiz and I laughed at a lot of the stuff going on. And that's how we sort of recognized each other as fellow laughers. And after a while of this kind of nonsensical so-called writers' conference, we decided to do a job of work. And he had a book of his poems translated into English that was published by the UN. And it was translated by somebody called Victor Kiernan, who I had never heard of, but I read it, and I saw that he was a wonderful poet, but the translations were in a language that I can only call Victorian. It was like reading Swinburne. Who's another Victorian poet? I can't think of it. Matthew Arnold, but he was very good. But I understood, even from those translations, that Faiz was a wonderful poet. So we decided to embark on the project of translating his poetry into colloquial English, the English of today, not of the 19th century. And we started, and this is the book that was published of those poems. It was published in 1987 by Princeton. Yes. And I called it The True Subject, because the true subject. Because Faiz had told me that he was a Sufi, that he had been educated in Sufism, and one of the tenets of Sufism was that poetry, the subject of poetry, and the true subject of poetry, is the loss of the beloved. And he told me this after I had told him that I read on the very first or second page of a book called The White Goddess by Robert Graves, that it was a letter that a poet named Alan Lewis, who was a Welsh poet, in Burma, serving with Faiz in the English army, and and this was in the Second World War, and they were fighting the Japanese. He had written to his friend, Robert Graves, that the true subject of poetry is the loss of the beloved. And I quoted those lines to Faiz, and that's when he said, oh, you know, he laughed. He said, well, I'm the one who told Alan Lewis that. So it was a very, I don't know, surreal, and yet very, very real kind of association. It was a ring, and this knowledge that I had gotten from the book by Robert Graves came back to Faiz through me. And it was kind of wonderful. And so I called the book The True Subject, and I talked about this series of encounters ending with me and Faiz in a greasy spoon in Honolulu. So we started on the project, and I know absolutely no Urdu, even less than. But he was perfectly fluent in both languages, Urdu and English. So I was able to ask him every question I had to. Why was that word chosen? What does it mean to you? What is its meaning in the poem? That's how we went along, from word to word, phrase to phrase, line to line, paragraph to paragraph, or in poetry, stanza to stanza. And then I tried to recreate the poem in English, and he was the control. Finally, I showed it to him, and he said yes or no. You don't have this. Of course, I had to give up certain things that exist in Urdu and are important. The first is rhyme. Couldn't do it. English is not a good rhyming language because it's not declined. There are no, they've practically disappeared in English. But I did try to get the meaning. The meaning is overall important, and the feeling tone, and the spirit of the poem. So that was important. So I'm going to read you some of the poems. Oh, Faiz was a master in his language of metaphor. He had to be, because there were so many things that were unmentionable in Urdu. Of course, there are many things that are unmentionable in English too, that people get around with metaphor if they can. So many of these poems seem to be about love and this and that. And yes, that's important, but they stood in for something else too. So they all have a meaning beyond the confines of the poem. Okay, this is called Any Belover, Any Lover to Any Beloved. The road to memory you have walked so long will end a few steps further on, where it turns on the way to oblivion. Neither you nor I exist there. My eyes can't bear it. They don't know if you might return, step into thin air and disappear, or look back over your shoulder. But these eyes are experienced in illusion. If they embrace you again elsewhere, another road like this one will spring into being, where, in the same way, the shadow of your hair, your arms swinging, will journey forth. The other possibility is equally false. There is no turning, nothing to hide you from me. So let the same road go on as it does, with you on it. And if you never look back, it doesn't matter.
Naomi, a bit louder, please.
I'm trying. trying to. Can everybody not hear me?
No, we heard you, but it was hard.
What?
They
We
heard
heard
you,
you, but it was hard. We had to be very
I'll
quiet
try again.
and listen carefully.
To me, I have a very loud voice. Is that loud enough?
It's loud.
I'm looking for some poems I think are very typical. Oh, here's one. I started reading this last night. It's called The Hour of Faithlessness. In a little while, the moon will be torn to shreds on every rooftop. The mirror stricken with longing for that lost reflection. The stars will rain down from the moist eye of heaven, star by star. On streets littered with the usual rubbish, in bedrooms exhausted by desire, someone will roll and unroll his loneliness. This is the hour of betrayal, when all who have met must part, when the key to the prison of self has disappeared. It is the hour of renunciation, when the festivities are over. I ask my vagrant heart, where is there to go now? No one belongs to anyone at this hour. Forget it. No one will receive you at this hour. Let it go. Where can you possibly go now? Even if you find someone, you will only regret it. Wait a while. Wait until every eye is open, a wound slashed by a razor streak of dawn. Then, we who have died, each one buried in the weariness of estrangement, will manage to rise again and go on with a search for a beloved friend. We will have forgotten the taste of loss at the end of night. I can't read the Urdu. It looks beautiful on the page, but it doesn't make any sense to me. But we've heard some Urdu today. There was one other poem I wanted to read, and I can't find it. I can't find it.
Why don't you read
Oh,
it?
here it is. This is a famous poem in Urdu. In English, it's "Don't ask me now, beloved. Don't ask me now, beloved, to love you as I did. When I believed life owed its luster to your existence, the torments of the world meant nothing. You alone could make me suffer. Your beauty guaranteed the spring, ordained its enduring green. Your eyes were all there was of value anywhere. If I could have you, faith would bow before me. None of this was real. It was all invented by desire. The world knows how to deal out pain, apart from passion, and mana for the heart beyond the realm of love. Warp and woof, the trappings of the rich are woven by the brutish spell cast over all the ages. Human bodies numbed by filth, deformed by injuries, cheap merchandise on sale in every street. I must attend to this too. What can be done? Your beauty still delights me. What can I do? The world knows how to deal out pain, apart from passion and mana for the heart, beyond the realm of love. Don't ask for me, beloved, love like that one.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask Syed Ali Naqvi to speak, and he is a retired civil engineer, and he has an interesting story about Faiz and also some interesting contextualizations about Faiz and his. Naqvi sir? Floor is yours.
Yes,
I think it's better.
आप इधर आ जाएंगे?
Yeah, तो
Paraphernalia.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have already heard the poems in Urdu and their translations. And you have also heard the development of Faiz himself, his poetry and so on and so forth. So there is nothing left much for me to say, I must say. But there are a few things which I might say. Faiz has been described as a poet, a journalist, a Marxian activist, etc., etc. And he is popularly known in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, the subcontinent as a whole, as a very progressive Urdu poet par excellence. He held the most prominent position as a poet after Iqbal, Urdu poet, after Iqbal. Iqbal died in 1938. He was a great poet of Urdu and Persian. Faiz was a poet of Urdu, and he came later and experienced new developments, which Iqbal never had seen. The independence, the partition of the subcontinent. Iqbal did not see those, but Faiz did. So that is reflected in his poems. The passion that Faiz had was different and on a higher and a greater plane than it was at the time of Iqbal. But he was a great poet. Iqbal was a great poet, no doubt, a poet. And after that, Faiz became, I wouldn't say in the same sense great, but certainly a very, very prominent poet after that. Iqbal, I have to compare with Iqbal somehow to understand Faiz. Iqbal did not create any new style. Definitely he had a new content, but he did not create any new style of poetry. Faiz created a new style of poetry, and that new style was an amalgam both of lyricism and politics, classicism and modernism. This was the combination, and this is the new style that Faiz created. As I said, Iqbal had definitely good content, but no new form. Faiz created a new form instead. Then the very interesting thing about Faiz works that we have is that we find the dates in the publications, which are not available in other great poets' publications. So they can be easily related to the events that they have taken place, historical events that they have taken place. For instance, starting from the independence time, his great and very popular poem is about the independence. Ye daag daag ujala, ye shab wazir shah tha. I cannot translate it, and I don't have to translate in front of you. But that is, I'm just telling you, just to show that this is related to a great event that has taken place. And Faiz is very passionately talking about that and saying, this is not what we expected. This is something like, this is dao dao, this is sorry. So this is not what he expected. But at the end of the poem, he also says that don't worry, you have to move forward. Although this is not what we expected, but this is not the end. You have to move forward. This is the end of that. So that is the beauty of it. And then, just about 4 years after independence, Faiz finds himself in the prison. He was imprisoned. He calls itself his own stupidity. These are his own words, my own stupidity. That he attended a meeting held by a general whom he met because he was also an army colonel during the war, during the Second World War. He had joined the army, and he became colonel in the army. So he had some relations with the higher generals also. So General Akbar was a general at that time. This was 1950, end of 1950. And the top brass of the army at that time was feeling very dissatisfied with how the country was being governed. And they even suggested that we should take over the government. So poor Faiz was invited to attend their meeting, and he really didn't know that what was going on. But he attended, and they said this, and Faiz said, no, this is not nothing. But then, of course, there was the intelligence people in that, and they reported it to the government. So they arrested everybody who attended the meeting. And those who were not even in the meeting, they were arrested. And that was called, because Rawalpindi was the headquarters of the army. So, and where this thing happened, this conspiracy so-called, happened there. So this was called Rawalpindi conspiracy case, tried in the court, and people got prison sentences. The lowest sentence was given to Faiz, 4 years. Others were given much higher sentences. But Faiz was one of those few lucky people who got 4 years only. But that period, imprisonment period, produced excellent literature in the form of new poetry. And again, I will not recite because I don't have the translation in front of me, but some very beautiful works out there. Then when he was arrested, he was already working as the editor of the newspaper called Pakistan Times, which was owned by his old friend Mia Iftikharuddin, who was a very progressive man, although he was a big landlord. But he was one of the most progressive people that we had in Punjab. I mean, it's an amazing thing, the contradiction. He was a big landlord, but at the same time, he was highly progressive. Like Mr. Bhutto later on, he was also a big landlord. But this happens like that, you know, the rich people, the wealthy people. Chuan Lai was also came from a rich, wealthy background. So anyway, this Mia Iftikharuddin created a new newspaper organization, progressive papers company, and Pakistan Times was one of their leading papers. And Faiz was asked to become the editor, and he accepted. So he came to Lahore and became the editor of this. This was before his imprisonment under the Albany case. Then after he was released, 4 years after, he again went to this paper. But after 3-4 years, martial law was imposed. This was Ayub Khan's martial. The first martial law, General Ayub Khan, 1950, October 1958. And they rounded up everyone whose name was on the files since 1920. So in the prison with Faiz, there were people of 90-year-old, 80-year-old, because everyone who was on the file since 1920, he was arrested by Ayub Khan. So Faiz stayed in the prison in Karachi, and then he was transferred to Lahore fort, and there he had beautiful poem that he has that is related to that, 1959. That is March or February 1959, and that is Aaj Bazaar Mein Papa Jona. Again, I do not have the translation, but it is a wonderful poem and sung by one of our beautiful musicians, Nayyaranu. Aaj Bazaar Mein Papa Jona. So that was written again in jail, in Lahore jail, in 1959. And after that, he was released. He was not, this time he was not kept away for a very long time. He was released after 6 months. Then again he went to his office, Pakistan Times office, and he was stunned to find that the office was taken over by the government. The entire progressive newspapers were taken over, nationalized by Ayub Khan government. So he was out of the job. And on the streets, he was declared together. So he was, he continued working on his own, writing, publishing, and so on and so forth. And although the government didn't bother him too much, but they were afraid of him. Not only Ayub Khan's government, but every government that came after that remained afraid of him. Now, this is my personal experience. I knew Faiz personally. I was acquainted with him. A number of times I met him. at my house also. He was my guest at the place where I lived during the construction of a large dam in Pakistan, on Mangla Dam, on Jhelum River. So I spent 11 years there. This Faiz came to me a couple of times to Mangla during my stay there. And this was the time when in 1967 or late 1967 or early 1968. I was sitting in my, and Faiz came and stayed at Mangla. And I was sitting in my office, and this morning he left, he already left. So this, a fellow entered in my room without even knocking, without any, he just came in, then closed. And he said, Faiz stayed with you? I was trying to like, what kind of question was that? I said, yes, he was my guest. He stayed with me. And he said, where is he now? I said, I don't know where he is now, but what he told me, that he was going to meet the president. This was Ayub Khan in Rawalpindi. So he told me that he was going to meet the president, and he must have gone there. So if you want, I can phone President House and find out if he has arrived. I picked up the telephone and he immediately, he then left. So this, I just want to tell you that he was, in spite of the fact that he was released from the jail and there was nothing going on against him, but the government was keeping a tab on him all the time, throughout. And this happened in the next martial law period, the Yahya Khan's martial law, second martial law, because Ayub Khan handed over the power to Yahya Khan. In fact, I was wondering when this Egypt protests were happening and were coming to a climax, and the president already resigned and left Hosni Mubarak and handed over power to the army general. So I thought it was a similar thing that Ayub Khan handed over power to another army general. Anyway, so this was the second martial law, but Faiz was not affected by that. But the third martial law, which was the most brutal one in Pakistan, and that was General Zia's. Not only brutal, but whatever is happening in Pakistan today, a lot of it is attributable to his rule and what he did. His program of Islamization, his program of setting up allowing the madrasas, allowing the mujahideens. Of course, those mujahideens were supported financially supported by the United States, Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabia financed establishment of these madrasas there, which have been teaching the most extremist type of Islam. And the results you see every day there. Suicide, bombing, Taliban. There is nothing like that before. During Ayub Khan's martial law, there was nothing like that before. It was more or less secular. Although the country was still called Islamic Republic of Pakistan, but it was very secular and tranquil. But here, the situation completely changed, and we are reaping the whatever you call them today, these acts of Zia, who was unfortunately supported in all ways, in many ways, financially, morally, politically by United States of America, Saudi and Saudi, of course, Saudi Arabia and Egypt at that time. Again, Hosni Mubarak was the president. The arms came from Egypt. Because they had the Soviet arms were still there, so they sold them to Saudis, and Saudis sent them to arm the Mujahideen with those arms. So this is what happened. So this martial law, which was imposed on the 5th of July 1977, Faiz could not tolerate anymore. And 1978 to 78, he decided to go out. And then although he was very depressed because of this, at the same time he was very optimistic. Basically optimistic. And he believed that the change comes through revolution. All historical changes, all significant historic changes have come through revolution. And a big change will definitely come. He was absolutely sure that a big change will come through revolution. So the poem that he wrote also he disclosed in the imagery of the Qiyamah, the last judgment day. The picturizes that in those words, but really he is predicting that no, this is inevitable. The change is inevitable, and that change will come through the revolution. And now I cannot read that, but we have distributed
Yes, the handouts have been given for that poem.
Huh?
Yeah. So because we need to wrap up so that there's a couple of questions can also come. So we need to wrap this up because so that Rafiq can read the poem and we can have the subject.
I can read.
No, Rafiq,
No.
Rafiq is going to read the
Okay,
poem.
okay.
So
Good. Because that's the most important thing, or that has the relevance to the present, what is happening in the Middle East today. The revolution is taking place, and change will take place through, although slowly and gradually, still there are lots of hurdles, but it is bound to happen, which Faiz has prophetically I would say, predicted.
thank you.
Is that?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
We have very little time left, but we have Rafiq Katwari, who's a businessman and a translator and a poet from Kashmir, and he's going to read a poem from Faiz, and I hope we have time for a couple of quick questions after that.
Okay, thank you. I'm privileged to be part of this group and be part of this very dedicated, strong group of poets and authors. I was first exposed to Faiz's poetry in Kashmir when I was in jail there, when I was a teenager, which wasn't too long ago, and it shaped my life. I was exposed to Faiz and to Iqbal, the other great South Asian poet of the 20th century. And in jail, I read 3 books, which I don't think I would have ever read: War and Peace, From Here to Eternity, and I started reading Proust's Remembrances of Things Past, which I still haven't finished. So I'm going to read this poem by Faiz. It's translated by Daoud Kamal, and I've just changed a couple of words because the word better with the rhythm when I read it. It's called We Will See. We will see, certainly we too will see that promised day, that day ordained when these mountains of tyranny and oppression will explode into wisps of hay. The day when the earth under our feet will quake and throb. And over the heads of despots, swords of lightning will flash. The day when all idols will be thrown out of this sacred world, and we, the destitute and despised, will at last be granted respect. The day when crowns will be tossed into the air, and all the thrones demolished. Only the name of God will remain, who is both absent and present, both the seen and the seer. The cry, I am truth, will rend the skies, which means you, I, and all of us, and sovereignty will belong to the people, which means you, I, and all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafiq. We have 5 minutes for questions or discussion. I'm sorry about that because we started a little bit late, so I don't know if that means we can go over a little bit. We can go a little bit longer. We can go till 12.
I'll check.
Okay. Well, because there's probably somebody else coming in afterwards, but I'll take it in the. What we'll do is we'll take 3 questions in the, and whoever wants to answer them. So introduce yourself, please, and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Bakht. I have a question, small question from Bilal. He talks about, so I don't know what you mean when you say the homeless language, or the homeless language. And then from Naki Saab, sorry, you mentioned something very important about the contradiction between, being a landlord or a feudal, and then being progressive. So how does that work, especially, I'm thinking more in context of, Faiz, for instance, or like, what Faiz, or how Faiz's name has become today. So I mean, or even Bhutto, for instance, कि आप Bhutto, for instance, socialism की बात करते हैं, and मगर वो landlord थे और feudal थे. So like how, he was, one of the 11 most influential families. So how does that work?
We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll just, go ahead.
My name is Hassan Mujtaba. My question is that Faiz Ahmed Faiz wrote, internationally. He always expressed solidarity in his poems with Africa, Latin America, and he was an internationalist. But one question always nagging everybody's conscience, that why he kept, I would say, his criminal mum over the genocide carried out by Pakistan's military in East Pakistan during 1971. Not only he did keep mum over the bloodbath of Bangladesh, people of Bangladesh, but he always returned his Lenin Prize to Soviet Union in protest. So would anybody answer this?
We'll just take a couple of more questions and then we'll go around. Who's next? Was anybody else? Somebody at the back?
I wish to come, and my name is Noor Saleh. This is a great panel. It was very enlightening and very beautiful session. I was really especially impressed by the Andrew McCord and Naomi Lazard. Like Faiz, we have been reading it since for a long time, but we enjoy it because it's our mother tongue. But the way you expressed it and your research you have done, it was highly informative, and I really thank you very much for that information. And especially your translation. Is it possible I could buy the book?
Yes, I have a question.
I don't sell the book. It's
Okay, but Amazon, you'll get it.
Go ahead, there's a question. Go ahead. Please.
That's for Harshdeep. You said something along the lines that he was a support that transcends national boundaries. And from what I have read, and that was one of the instances where Faiz was quoted in India, where somebody pointed out that poetry has no nationality, no national origin and ethnicity. And he said, yes, that's true. It's the poetry that transcends the national boundaries, not the poet himself. Poet has a hometown, home country. He comes from somewhere. He's not a homeless or a person not coming from without any boundaries. So, is that what you were trying to say, that it's his poetry that transcended, or was it his self that transcended?
We can take the.
Okay, so I think I'll try to answer both your question and Baht's question. Look, I mean, I'm using homeless as a sort of rhetorical device, I should confess. So, I mean, I don't want you guys to take that too seriously. I think it's both, actually. So for your question, I mean, you know, the fact that towards the end of his life, he was really, I mean, he died 2 years after he came back from Beirut, you know, and I mean, he did certainly identify himself as a Pakistani, I'm sure. And the thing is, the question that he struggled over repeatedly in his prose writing is this question of Pakistani culture, right? That I don't think he ever answered, and that some of us think that, you know, can never really be answered, right? To a satisfactory degree. So, you know, I would say that he transcends nationality, and so does his poetry. I would say both. Now, as for the other question about homeless language, I mean, you know, this is just again, it's a sort of personal view that I don't think Urdu has. I don't think it has a country that it can be attached to, and that's just a personal view of mine. So that's. I mean, you can agree or disagree with that, but that's all.
Thank you.
Yeah, that question about the landlords and progressive landlords. This appears to be a contradiction, but it is not so. If you look at the historical people, then you won't find that contradiction. Because now in our part of the world, particularly India, Pakistan, Punjab and Sindh, they are big landlords, and they are the people who have the wealth, and they can also afford to send their children to abroad, Oxford and Cambridge, and getting their education. And those, when they go to in those universities, some very intelligent ones also adopt the. For instance, Mr. Faiz himself says that his colleagues, some of his colleagues in the government college, when he was teaching the government college, some colleagues came from Oxford, and they were communists. So actually, he was introduced to Marxism by those rich, and he said they were aristocratic. They came from aristocratic families and wealthy families. So that is what it happens. So Mayor Takharuddin was a big landlord, but at the same time he got all education in England, and he was very prominent. He was also a member of the Indian National Congress. Not only a member, but he was one of their leaders of the Indian. But then when Pakistan movement was going on, so he joined the Muslim League, and he established the progressive newspapers company. And this happened in other countries also. Like I mentioned Chou En-lai, he came from a rich family. Mao perhaps was not that rich, but Chou En-lai definitely came from a wealthy family. And Marx's associate, Engels, was already an industrialist, a capitalist. There was nothing wrong with that.
I'll take the question about
To be a capitalist is not different from being a critic of capitalism.
On the question about Bangladesh, it's an interesting question, and I think actually the question of 1971 is in a way it's the unresolved question of Pakistan. it's a question which couldn't be resolved by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and the legacy of that is part of the failure of progressive politics in Pakistan. For Faiz himself, I'm not sure what he said in terms of public statements in that time in 1970, 71. I mean, he made a statement denouncing the Soviet, Indo-Soviet Friendship Pact, which was, he was patronized by the Soviet Union. So that was a break. Otherwise, there was no record of him speaking against the Soviet Union. He didn't, for instance, speak against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. And he didn't in Lahore. Tahira Mazhar Ali, Tariq Ali's mother, went around with a petition, to sign against the atrocities in I guess initially in Dhaka, and got very few signatures. Faiz was in Karachi at that time. There's no record I've seen of him making a public statement in prose about what was going on. But in his poetry at the time, I'm not sure where it was published in periodicals, but in his book Sarevade Sina, which was published in 1971 itself. And if you picture Pakistan at that time, it was very controversial to say anything sympathetic about Bangladesh, despite the atrocities. But Faiz writes, the poem is titled Hizr Karo Mere Tan Se, which is Get Away From My Body. Saje Toke Se Saje Katle Am Ka Mela. So how do we embellish a festival of common slaughter? Kisse batayega mere lahu ka what is it? Vavela. So how shall I describe the cries of my blood? I mean, it's a very graphic, poetic description of what was going on in Dhaka. So he was a poet, and I've written on this some. I think if one wants to judge the responsibility of a poet, the first place is in his poetry, and he did address at the time the events of '71 in Bangladesh, and then there's a very well-known poem of his, which he wrote. Bhutto in '73, I think, he went to Dhaka, and it was going to be the rapprochement of West Pakistan and Bangladesh, and he brought some others along, including Faiz, and I think Faiz thought he was going to be named ambassador to Bangladesh, but in Ayub Mirza's book, he tells the story. All he did was he sat in the Intercontinental Hotel in Dhaka the whole time, and Bhutto was having discussions which were, ambiguous. And he says very movingly, because Faiz had been in East Pakistan, he made his movie Jago Hua Savera there in the 50s about the lives of the fishermen. He was a leading leftist. The left in East Pakistan was much stronger and much more broadly based than in West Pakistan. He had friends there. But he says no one would come, no one would invite him to their house in Dhaka. They came to the coffee shop in the Intercon, and they did meet. But he says frankly that it was a difficult meeting. The old friendship wasn't there. Anyway, so he returned, and I think people say he had the poem when he got off the plane. And the famous lines are Hum ke thehre ajnabi itne madaraton ke baad fir banenge ashna kitne mulaqaton ke baad. So we who've remained strangers for so long. Anyway, he did acknowledge it in his poetry.
I'm sorry, we're really out of time now, so thank you very much for the time.